All right, chain of command enthusiasts, we're jumping in with some tank tactica here. We're building that checklist to utilize armor on the table. And this is interesting because chain of command being a historical rule set means we're looking at the time period, we're looking at the tech, we're looking at the powers, and we are simulating the rules to represent that. So what you see with tanks, they're extremely, extremely powerful. They are game changers. You're paying the support points to get those on the table. In the right position, utilized correctly, they are a massive breakthrough unit. They're just going to roll through everything. You're going to be like, what the heck is going on? This is extremely overpowered. But used incorrectly, or if they can be put in a compromised position, they are extremely vulnerable. It is very, very swingy with how they operate, and losing a tank is massive because not only does it force you to take a hit and roll on the command table. I mean, you could spend a command die to negate that, but you've spent it. It's also the loss of that unit and the loss of that support, those support points that you paid. So now you're potentially outnumbered because tanks are going to be few and far between in chain of command, even if you're trying to get a lot on the table like I usually do. Compared to other wargaming systems, there's not a lot. Now, compare this to, say, Warhammer 40,000 or other wargaming systems where the tank doesn't really behave like a tank. It's just a wound counter. It's just eye candy on the table. It's got a couple of neat rules, but it can engage any unit. Any unit can engage it, and it operates outside of the scope of historical wargaming. So if you're making that jump, we want to begin to look at this tactica. We want to begin to look at these questions. So jumping in, attacker and defender, both perspectives mixed together, what to be aware of, what to look out for. Every tank is going to have two sets of dice. You're going to have a main gun. How many dice you roll depends if you're going high explosive or armor piercing, and depends on the gun, but that's going to be one set of dice. This is usually mounted in a turret, although some tanks have a fixed forward facing, and you're going to have movement to line it up. And then we're going to see a machine gun. It could be mounted forward facing. It could be in the turret. It could be like the Sherman 50 caliber on top, plus the turret mounted, plus the hull mounted. So you're going to get additional sets of dice, usually one, to leverage this and push forward. Against infantry, chain of command range is pretty much line of sight. So if you can begin firing on infantry with a tank at range, it is just absolutely going to maul them. You have high volume of dice with the machine gun. You have a high volume of dice, high explosive, also removing cover, bringing cover down a little bit. So if there's infantry behind a wall, and infantry can't effectively counter it. You need to have an anti-tank team, anti-tank weapons, or be a tank yourself. If a tank can get into position, elevated position, line of sight, every single turn, it is just going to be smashing down on infantry, and there's very little to nothing that they can do. So you want to stay out of sight if a tank's on the table. Now, this is kind of true of everything in chain of command, because the system is very, very deadly, and you need to pick when you're going to engage, and you want to hide, and you want to move, and you want to scoot and shoot, and you want to utilize buildings. But even infantry versus infantry, we can work where if I have two infantry units, or if I have a machine gun team, I can put that machine gun team on Overwatch and now start to advance my infantry team. And if you engage me, that machine gun is going to get that free shot. That machine gun is going to leverage dice while my infantry engage you. Tank, I don't have to worry about that. You can have teams on Overwatch. Take that Overwatch. Nothing's going to happen. We're essentially invulnerable against most things in the game. Now, as we move closer, this is where things start to change for a tank. It's one thing if the mission is I can just stay back and shoot from a distance. I've got my jump-off points to have screening units. So if you have an anti-tank team that's carrying handheld anti-tank weapons like a Piat or a bazooka, you're never going to get to range. If you deploy out with anti-tank, long range, will fire back and forth, but those infantry-operated teams are also vulnerable to my infantry. If another tank appears on the table, well, now we're having a tank battle. But generally speaking, at range, I'm as safe as I'm going to be. But we also want to advance with a tank. Now, this is where things become interesting, because since a tank is invulnerable to most of the stuff on the table, it's great for breaking through and capturing jump-off points. It's great for obtaining mission objectives on the other side of the table. It's great for physically blocking other infantry units or working as the perfect escort for infantry. And likewise, infantry are going to escort tanks. So we are going to be mobile, and we are going to be pushing forward with that tank. Very rarely we're just going to be hanging out in the back and shooting. As we move forward, this is where the vulnerabilities come in. If I'm not operating on a road, if I decide to go off-road, as I cross certain terrain types, there's a chance I'm going to get stuck. There's a chance the tank is going to become immobilized. And as soon as that happens, I am extremely vulnerable, because now I don't have the movement bonus of when something that can shoot at me and destroy me or cripple me comes into play. I'm literally just sitting there. And because I'm not able to move, I won't be able to get hull down. The damage to the tank is directly influenced. If you're shooting straight on, I'm hull down. I have the heaviest armor there. I have the lowest profile. That gives me the best chance of surviving against any type of anti-tank weapon, even the more powerful ones. If you can catch me on the side, I'm in trouble. If you can catch me on the rear arc, then even the heaviest tank is going to fold very, very fast, even against handheld anti-tank weapons like a bazooka. So becoming immobilized is like the last thing that you want to have happen as a tank, because you're literally just sitting there. So as you advance, this is where we first start to see the tactica and the choices the commander has to make. Do I stay on the road and utilize that? I don't have to worry about becoming immobilized, but my opponent knows where I'm going to be. If they've got some ambush teams, if they've got a jump-off point and they've got a chain of command die saved up, we're going to talk about that in a moment, and they can just ambush with a bazooka team or a Panzerschreck, we're in trouble. We're in trouble. Or do I go off-road, away from their jump-off points, or tactically, like I can screen with infantry and have that and try to stay far away, or utilize cover or approach with hull down towards a mission objective, but depending on the terrain, do I become immobilized? And that is something you have to think about. That is something that you have to think about. As we approach with the tank, this is where tanks become extremely vulnerable to infantry. Having an anti-tank team in reserve, having a chain of command die loaded, so as I advance, when I come in range, if you hit with the ambush, I can potentially counter that, but you'll still get that shot off. I mean, I can move with my tank. I can park it. I can use a chain of command die to interrupt. I can go into potentially Overwatch. I mean, there are counters that represent in the rules, like I'm going down that road, there's hedgerows everywhere. I know there's a bazooka team potentially somewhere there, so I'm ready. But will I be able to kill that bazooka team before it shoots me? And if it jumps out and it gets side armor or it gets rear armor, that is a very, very challenging question. And that's where tanks become very, very vulnerable as they advance. So that's something that we need and we want to be careful and take a look at. Jumping in for a second, depending on the flow of battle, ideally, sharing my perspective, I like to advance very slowly. I like to get some key units, my tanks out first, at long range on my side of the table, screen my jump-off points, maybe an infantry squad. I like to get my machine gun teams up. Before I start deploying infantry in scale and start advancing, I like to build up my command dice. I like to have a chain of command die that I can spend for an interrupt, or I can spend for an ambush. When I move out playing tanks, I find I need to have one of these banked to potentially interrupt or potentially deal with anti-tank teams to try and counter them as I go. So having that reserve means I'm ready to move out. Tactically, as the attacker, well, if I'm the attacker and you're the defender, that's a question of, do you let Fritz get in the ideal position with his tanks and save up those command dice, and sometimes maybe have two of those in the bank? Or do I attack before he's ready? Do I kind of go for that vulnerability? So we have a little bit back and forth. Now let's jump in tank versus tank. This is where things get extremely interesting, because it's not so much the main gun. Obviously, the more powerful the main gun, the better. But it's the armor. Some of the missions that I was recently playing in Chain of Command, I had Panzer IIIs going up against Sherman tanks. And while the Sherman certainly isn't the best tank in the game, and certainly against late war German tanks, Tiger tanks and things like that, despite what Fury says, those Tiger tanks will just maul the Shermans. The fact that we were looking at early to mid-war Panzer IIIs, which is a fine tank in itself against infantry. It's a great tank for the firepower that it brings versus the points paid to get it on the table. But against a Sherman tank, especially if taken in numbers, those threes are very, very vulnerable. They don't have the armor. So tank versus tank, now it becomes a battle of hull down 100%. And ideally not getting hit, because as soon as you get hit, it becomes easier to get hit next time. And tank versus tank battles, this is essentially who can hit the other person first, fast, and furious. So what you see with maneuverability, tank versus tank, is I really don't want to be out in the open. I might be able to cross that field if there's just infantry in play and flush them out. But if it's tank versus tank, I want to hide behind a building and be hull down, or I want to move around buildings. I want to move around things and try to really get position on my opponent where I can shoot them first, because given the tech of the tanks, especially as we move to mid and later war, one shot could potentially take out that tank. I mean, yes, it is a dice-based game. You could have the best modifiers, the best shot, be in the closest band range, and like you still roll awful. Likewise, there's times where just it's going to be impossible to hit that tank, and just the dice gods reward you. I mean, it is a wargaming system. There's always going to be that absolute swing representing the fog of war. But generally speaking, close to close, tank to tank, whoever shoots first stands a good chance of destroying that tank, or the real bane of a tank, shock, putting shock on. Because that junior commander, or if you're playing with some of the supplements, if you have a senior commander upgraded into that tank, that's still burning turns, that's still burning commands to take that shock off. I want to have all three, because I want to move and shoot, or I want to move and move, or I want to move, and or shoot and shoot. I want all those commands. I don't want to take shock off. And I need to be very, very careful with the shock, because the rules of shock for tanks, they'll bail and abandon it. Tactically, that represents on the table, I took a couple of hits. The tank is still functioning, but it's smoking, it's burning, it's taking some damage, and like, look, let's bail out, let's get out of here. Where infantry units are a lot more robust in that they take the shock, they start becoming less combat effective, they get pinned, but technically they're still in the game. So even if you have an infantry unit that has a lot of shock, you could potentially bring it back. So sometimes you can press the shock. I've got my senior commander issuing orders, and if a team has a lot of shock, maybe I'll let it sit because I need to issue some orders and activate other things. Tanks, you need to be removing shock if it's on there, because it will catch up to you so fast, you'll bail out, and that's a roll on the table. And technically, you didn't really have to necessarily lose that tank. So vastly different rules, vastly different approaches. I want to leverage my tank against infantry, high explosive machine guns. When I advance, it's going to be in support with infantry, and I'm going to try and stock up some command dice, because those ambush teams, bazooka teams, Piat, Panzer Schreck, Panzer Faust, whatever it's going to be, they're out there. I don't want to get hit with that, or maybe it's a pack if I'm playing on the German side. And then likewise, tank to tank, it depends very much on the tech level, but also who can get that jump first, and it becomes extremely maneuverable. It becomes extremely about terrain and movement and making that choice. So very, very dynamic, very, very different than sci-fi based wargaming systems or wargaming systems that have a universe that's not historical, where like tanks do magical things and really kind of behave like race cars from that perspective on the table.